Hi, my name is Jasmine Cox, and today I'll be talking about autism spectrum disorder. So first we're going to talk about what is it. Autism spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it's considered a pretty complex disability. It is judged on a spectrum, or a continuous cycle of different severities, and it's really noted between early infancy and 3 years of age. It's recognized mostly in males. 4 times more likely males are diagnosed with autism than females. It's derived from the Greek word autos, meaning isolated self. This explains how many people with autism are viewed. It was once categorized under 5 different types, which is non-specified, Asperger's, PPD, Rett syndrome, and childhood degenerative disorder. In the current DSM, it is one large spectrum and is noted by 3 different characteristics. These are impaired social development, diminished communication skills, and restrictive repetitive behaviors. The DSM-6 is identifying 3 new types of autism spectrum disorders, which are nonverbal learning disabilities, communication disorders, and hyperplexia. Continuing on, we'll talk about prevalence. It is in 1% of the world population. In the United States, it accounts for 1 in 59 births, which is an increase from 2004, when the birth rate was 1 in 125, and currently affects 3.5 million Americans and is steadily increasing. Comparable to the US are Western Europe, Canada, and Australia, but China and Japan are actually having higher rates. The history of autism is pretty extensive. In 1909, Eugene Buehler presented schizophrenia for the first time. It was in 1911 that Eugene Buehler also noted autism as a way to describe symptoms that categorized childhood schizophrenia. Autism in the 1920s was still not understood very well. It was thought to be created by diet, and thus they attempted to use biochemical treatments to cure those with autism. In 1930s, we took another turn where electroconvulsive therapy was used to try to shock those with autism into losing the presented behaviors. In the 1930s, you've seen the electroconvulsive shock therapy, and then autism was used to describe children with social or emotional disabilities in the 1940s. In 1943, Leo Kanner, a doctor from Johns Hopkins University, began studying the behavioral symptoms of 11 children. These children were thought to have mental retardation, and they suffered from symptoms such as difficulty developing speech, social acts, engagement and repetitive behaviors, difficulty adapting to change, sensory disorders, clumsiness, and difficulties with any spontaneous activity. The strengths these children have, though, were good memories and good intellect. And Kanner described this as infantile autism. In 1944, just shortly after, Hans Asperger began studying children with autism-like symptoms also. This was 4 different children, and all 4 were males. They had behavioral and social issues, but had no speech or language delays. These children were later followed into adulthood, and one became a Nobel Prize winner, as well as one an astrologist. In 1952, the DSM-1 was released. Autism was associated with childhood schizophrenia in this edition. In the 1960s, we're still looking at treatments that were not necessarily morally correct because pain and punishment were inflicted on children to prevent autism symptoms. Bruno Beulem also stated that autism was caused by cold, unloving mothers at the time, and this was called refrigerator mothers. The children were usually taken away from the parents for long periods of time, and this was countered by Bernard Rimland. Rimland in 1964 published a book called Infantile Autism, the Syndrome and its Implementation for Neural Theory and Behavior. This book really allowed for literature to extend the knowledge of autism. Rimland established the Autism Society of America in 1965 before autism was really separated into its own diagnostic category. In 1968, autism was still believed to be linked to childhood schizophrenia. In 1979, the Wings Triad was created to discover and describe the different categories for autism that we spoke to about earlier: the contact, communication, and the limited imagination of those with autism. In the 1980s, behavioral therapy was used, and autism was finally separated from childhood schizophrenia. Neurosensory development was also introduced, and the Erica Foundation started education and therapy for psychotic children. And also in the 1980s, the DSM-3 was released, and autism was included as infantile autism. This led to many diagnoses that were not exactly considered autism, but the broad definition created problems. In 1987, the DSM-3R was released, and the diagnosis became much more concrete and observable. In 1981, Ivar Lovis furthered the behavioral analysis and treatment of those with autism, and he published Teaching Developmentally Disabled Children, the Me Book. This book really launched literature for autism even further and acceptance towards autism. In 1987, autism was expanded to autism disorder, and in 1990, disabilities really took a turn when the IDEA Act, the Individual Disabilities and Education Act, was passed to assist those with disabilities. In 1991, the U.S. government made autism its own special ed category, so under the IDEA law, those with autism could get a free and appropriate education in a special ed classroom. In 1974, the DSM-4 was released, and pervasive developmental disorders were added. Of these, there were 16 symptoms, and 6 must be present to diagnose the disorder. Also in the 1990s, holding therapy was still used, but behavioral therapy became widely known and focused on positive rewards and controlled learning environments. In 2002, Lovis published another book, Teaching Individuals with Developmental Delays, the Basic Intervention category. This allowed those like teachers and parents to work better with those with autism. Then in 2007, Colorado, Indiana, Maryland, and Wisconsin were the first to develop Medicaid waivers for those with autism, and several other states followed quickly after. In 2004, Achieving a Better Life Act allowed those with autism to have a savings account, and this really helped those save for things like retirement or for caregivers that were much needed. And currently, autism has a lot more following and a lot more understanding. There's not really a single cause that's been identified, but several general causes have been accepted, such as abnormalities in the brain structure or function and genetics. There's been 100 genes identified, the codes are still being studied. We do know that 10% of children with autism, though, do have chromosomal disorders. Another cause is heredity, because we've noted that patterns exist in families, and medical issues. Those with things like Fragile X and congenital rubella and viral infections, immunodeficiencies, and metabolic diseases are also more likely to have autism. Signs and symptoms of autism are widely varied. There are 4 different categories stated by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. The first category being communication, such as lack of delayed speech, repetitive language, difficulty initiating or maintaining conversations, and the use of scripted language. A second category is social behavior. There's difficulties making eye contact, inability to interact with others, lack of response to one's own name, lack of empathy or emotional understanding, low understanding of communication through nonverbal means, and an isolated tendency. More symptoms would be a third category, stereotyped behavior such as problems with executive functioning, poor coordination, atypical body movements, or difficulties with instruction. And other behaviors would be narrow or intense interest, and on the more severe end, there's tantrums, aggression, injurious behavior, property destruction, non-compliance, regression, or an intense reaction to sensations. Diagnoses are very strict. There are 6 components of a comprehensive diagnostic evaluation. First is the parent or caregiver interview that sends out a questionnaire speaking about issues the child's having and different developmental notes. Then a review of medical, psychological, or school records, a cognitive or developmental assessment, direct play observation, measurements of their adaptive functioning, and then a comprehensive medical exam. These are all collected and consulted with senior clinicians, and they integrate this findings and personal judgment to come up with a diagnosis. And the last thing we're going to talk about is a case study. The Autism Society had Mitchell come forward, who was a 4-year-old patient when he was diagnosed. He presented with troubles making eye contact, very vague language. He steered his language to his favorite topics, which were farm tractors and images at Mount Rushmore. He didn't like to listen to other people talk, and he had focus and attention deficit issues. He didn't play much with other children, but liked to interact with adults, and he had several bouts of anxiety. He was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and this was performed by a multidisciplinary team at the University Medical School in their local hometown. And a treatment example for him was speech therapy, where he practiced looking at the listener and using the exact right words to answer questions. These all came together to assist Mitchell in creating a positive life, and he also turned around and worked with others with autism. So I hope this has given you a little bit more knowledge about autism spectrum disorder, and I thank you for watching.